Amazing grace. Grace that transforms and trains, but can be misunderstood or misinterpreted. How should we respond to these misconceptions? Listen as Pastor John Mark Bartlett explains. He begins with a quote from Martin Lloyd-Jones.
This is what he wrote concerning this same verse in Romans 6:1. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? This is what Martin Lloyd-Jones wrote. He said, the true preaching of the gospel of salvation by grace alone always leads to the possibility of this charge being brought against it. What charge? All right, since God's grace is so good, we could just live any way we want to live then. It seems like that's what you're saying. The more we sin, the more God's grace will abound. Martin Lloyd-Jones says, there is no better test as to whether a man is really preaching the New Testament gospel of salvation than this, that some people might misunderstand it and misinterpret it to mean that it really amounts to this, that because you are saved by grace alone, it does not matter at all what you do. You can go on sinning as much as you like because it will all redound all the more to the glory of grace. This is a very good test of gospel preaching. If my preaching and presentation of the gospel of salvation does not expose it to that misunderstanding, then it is not the gospel. What is Martin Lloyd-Jones saying? He says grace is so amazing that if you preach it and people are not amazed, you have not preached grace. If when you finish preaching grace, people just say, okay, that's good, then you haven't preached it. When you preach grace, people must be astonished. People must say to themselves, can this be true? People will say, heresy, wickedness, slackness. When you hear people preach like that, you know that you have started to preach the gospel. Because the gospel is so amazing. Grace is so amazing that when you first encounter it, it blows your mind. But I don't know about you, brethren. My testimony is that every time I encounter grace, my mind is blown. Every time I hear Martin Luther, the reformer, he said, every time that he heard a message about Calvary, he felt as if Jesus Christ had died just yesterday. Is that the way you feel? Does Calvary affect you that way? Martin Lloyd-Jones, the same man I just quoted from, he said whenever he heard the gospel of grace being preached, he felt like he wanted to get saved all over again. That's when grace is preached, that's the feeling that we must get. What is this? How could God love me so much? If you think, and if I think that we deserve to be saved, then something is radically wrong with our understanding of grace. So, if we preach or teach about the grace of God, and somebody does not ask us a similar question to the question that Paul posed in Romans 6 and verse 1, then we have failed to preach or teach the gospel in its fullness. When we teach or preach the gospel of God in its fullness, and legalists or persons who don't understand grace ask us, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? What answer must we give them? We must give them the answer that Paul gave them in verse 2. Romans chapter 6 verse 2. By no means. How can we who die to sin still live in it? Or as the King James Version translates it, God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? That's how we must answer them. Pastor Bartlett, are you saying that I can live any way that I can because of God's grace? God forbid. When people ask us that question, brethren, do not get angry. Understand that it is because they do not know grace. They do not understand grace. Because if they understood grace, they would know that the same grace that saves them is the grace that trains them and teaches them to deny ungodliness and worldly laws. I don't have the time to unpack this, but listen to me. You see, if you look at Romans chapter 6, verses 2 to 14, Paul answers the question. And what does Paul do? He shows the mechanical impossibility of a believer continuing to live a life of habitual sin. He explains what there is in the inner spiritual makeup of a believer, which prevents him or her from habitually obeying the instructions of the totally depraved Adamic human nature, what we call the flesh. This new inner spiritual makeup is the result of a major surgical operation which God performs in the inner being of every person he saves. When God saves a person, what happens is that in this internal spiritual surgery, God breaks the power of indwelling sin and he imparts the divine nature to the believing sinner. As a consequence of this, it is impossible for the believing sinner to maintain the same kind of relationship with the flesh that he or she had before he or she was saved. So what are you saying, Pastor? I am saying, as I have said many times before, that before we were saved, we could sin with impunity and feel no conviction. Now that we are saved, when we sin, we feel awful. We feel terrible. We feel convicted. Sometimes we want to hide. Conviction can be so strong when we sin that even though nobody knows about it, we feel like everybody can read us up. When God convicts us, it can be so strong that although nobody else knows about it, we don't want to come to prayer meeting. We don't want to come to church. And as I have said before many times, one of the surest signs that we are genuinely saved is the ability to feel bad when we sin. If you and I say we are children of God and we can sin with impunity, we can sin and never feel any conviction, something is seriously wrong.
How can we who died to sin still live therein after such an encounter? As we meditate on these words, let us examine ourselves, our response to the message of grace, and our response to our sin.